QSO Today, episode 247, George Misic, KE8RN. This episode of QSO Today is sponsored by ICOM America, makers of the finest HF, VHF, and UHF transceivers for the radio amateur, who are excited to announce the new IC9700 VHF, UHF, and 1200 MHz all-mode transceiver, shipping now. More on this later, and by QRP Labs, Hans Summers G0 UPL's kit company, and creators of many fine radio kits and products, including the popular QCX transceiver kit. Please support the QSO Today podcast by supporting these fine sponsors. Links to both are in this week's show notes page. Welcome to the QSO Today podcast. I'm Eric Guth, 4Z1UG, your host. George Misic, KE8RN, is an RF and analog engineer by training, a collector of vintage American amateur radio equipment, and an early pioneer in the development of MRI or magnetic resonance imaging machines, and whose name is on 38 patents around this technology. George was kind enough to accept my invitation, even though he is currently a resident of a rehabilitation hospital where he is receiving physical therapy. He is still a frequent author of articles for QST and electric radio magazines, and is my QSO Today. KE8RN, this is Eric, 4Z1UG. Are you there, George?
Yes, I am.
George, thanks for joining me on the QSO Today podcast. Can we start at the beginning of your ham radio story? When and how did it start for you?
Actually, my father was a ham, was first licensed in the late 30s. Ham radio, I think, helped him a good bit during the Second World War, because he was a radar specialist. That kept him from being cannon fodder, which was good. Anyhow, I remember him having a station set up in our house. There was one in the basement, a little bit of stuff. He had a den upstairs and had a little bit of equipment up there.
Now, it's my understanding that during World War II, amateur radio was suspended.
Yes.
So, did he operate ham radio during? Well, obviously, he didn't. But did he still have radio equipment, or was he operating in some, local emergency groups?
No, he actually was in the Marine Corps. Being a radar specialist was a real good thing because it reduced the number of people that were shooting at you, so it improved your odds of getting through the war pretty much unscathed, which he did.
So you were inspired by your father's ham radio beginnings. Do you remember his call sign?
Yes, it was W8VRJ.
How about that? And when did you get your first license?
The license arrived in the mail the day President Kennedy was shot. So I remember when it was, November 22, 1963. It's easy to remember.
And that was a novice?
No. I got a technician license immediately because I was always kind of a technical person.
And by this time, were you in high school?
Yeah, I was 14 when I got the license. And I was WA8LEM back then, which of course stood for Lunar Excursion Module.
And what was your first rig?
My father had a Gonsup G50 6-meter transceiver, so I used it. That was the first thing I made contacts with. And I actually built a 2-meter transmitter using a 6146 tube in the final. I was in the out of the ARRL handbook, and I used an Amico converter. Fairly right about then, I actually bought a National HRO7, which was advertised in the local weekly newspaper. It was for sale by the original owner, and I bought that from him. I still have it. It still works very well.
So in those days, you were able to operate as a technician in the HF bands in the novice area, right? So you had novice privileges in those?
No, they did not back then. We had privileges from 50 megahertz, 6 meters on up. So we were on, the lowest band I was on then was 6, and my primary interest was 2. I was on 2-meter AM. I actually bought a Heathkit Tour transceiver, which I built, and I made a few contacts with it, but it was far and away not the performer that the transmitter I built and the Amico converter was. I had the Amico converter in front of a HRO7, and that worked very well.
What kind of DX could you operate on 2-meter AM?
You could normally, most of it was local, but I worked, worked in Michigan, Indiana, Pennsylvania. I was in Ohio at the time, West Virginia, and probably about the best I did. I heard a station from Tennessee on once. Actually, that was the only CW contact I ever made, because it was Aurora was the propagation, and the AM signals were really pretty badly distorted. So I just plugged the key into the cathode current jack of the transmitter I had built. I sent a CW call to the station I heard from Tennessee, and he came back. So that was kind of a good thrill on 2 meters. That was not bad for the time.
Now, when did you upgrade?
Well, I'm trying to remember now. It was a fair number of years later when they changed the requirements for the extra so you didn't need 20 words a minute. I took the written test for it. I passed that, of course. So I got an extra class license, which is what I have now. I think I got that about in the early 80s, I would guess.
So you operated as a technician through that period of time. How did your operation on, in the technician bands, 6 meters and above, how did that change over time?
I really enjoyed it. I built initially a very simple transmitter for sideband on 6 meters, and I ultimately put together a transmitter on 6 and 2 meters that ran SSB and AM, of course CW. Not that I used it, but it did. The transmitter I built ran single sideband with the same filter that was used in the Galaxy radios, 9 megahertz. I also built a plate modulator into that transmitter for AM because I always enjoyed AM. I still do. I have set up at home right now. I have a Collins 32V3, and I got that with a 75A3. I actually use a 75A2 with it because I like the bandwidth selections on it better. And I enjoy running AM with that, and then I have a Collins S line to run sideband. So I have both of those available.
So those are the current rigs?
Those are the ones, and I also have in that same table, I built the tables out of 2 kitchen cabinets and doors. I made a bunch of tables for the various rigs I have. I have a KWM 380, the last rig Collins made, which is a very nice transceiver. It covers, of course, all the bands at solid state, and the receiver's general coverage. It's digital readout and stuff. It's a very nice piece of equipment.
Did ham radio make a difference in the choices that you made for your education and career?
Oh, I would say so. Actually went to Case Institute of Technology in Cleveland, which is now part of Case Western Reserve University. I was accepted a number of places, including MIT, Stanford, and Purdue, but my mother had multiple sclerosis and was in a wheelchair, so it was advantageous if I was available at home every night to help care for her. So I did that, and that kept me in the greater Cleveland area. I actually commuted to college.
What did you learn there? Was that electronics?
Yeah, I took electrical engineering, and I tried as much as I could. I stayed with the analog courses. That's kind of been my specialty. I was analog and RF engineering. After I graduated from college, I was working at a radio, the ham radio department in a store in Cleveland. So I did sales and service of equipment. I basically did all of the service work and reconditioned used stuff. It was kind of fun. And I did that until actually it was Pioneer Standard originally, and they, in 1971, got rid of their retail businesses and became strictly an industrial distributor. And they're still very active, very big in that business today. And one of the son of one of the principals of Pioneer Standard started his own business. He bought the retail outlets, and his family actually owned the building we were in at that time. So the Pioneer Standard moved. He stayed in the old building and he had three businesses, a ham radio department, which also sold commercial sound equipment. They had a hi-fi department, sold home audio, and a parts department that sold tubes and components. Well, they had the ham radio department. We sold Collins, Drake, Signal One, Hallicrafters, Tedtech. Those were, I think, I did mention Hallicrafters. We also sold National.
All American brands.
At that time, I started there at Pioneer Standard in '68, and I stayed. It became Farr Electronics in '71, and I stayed there until Farr went out of business in '74. And I kind of did things on my own. I continued to do commercial sound installations, and I opened a business that repaired stereo equipment, and I had that for a good number of years.
Now, according to your resume that you sent to me, you worked for Dentron Radio beginning in 1981. Yes. I remember Dentron. In the QST magazines, they were making some antenna tuners with the big caps and the roller inductors and amplifiers. What was Dentron Radio, and what kind of products were you working on?
Well, mostly tuners and amplifiers. Plus, I actually did a thing for them we called the MLX Mini. They made, maybe 800 of them. It was a single band SSB CW transceiver, quite small, had digital readout, ran about 25 watts. It was a super hip receiver. Kind of a nice little rig. I actually have ones I bought off eBay after the company was gone. We built those in quantity for 80, 75 meters, 40, and 20, and we prototyped units but never built large quantities for 15, 10, 6 meters, and 160. So.
Now, was there a market in those days for single-band transceivers?
Yeah, they actually did pretty good with it. We sold every one we built. I think when the company, it was the actual end of it, the bank that held the small business administration loan that Dentron used to start with, they basically closed the company down in '83.
So it only lasted for you a couple of years. And now this message from ICOM America. Create your own band opening. ICOM's newest SDR transceiver, the IC9700, is coming soon. This new VHF, UHF, and 1.2 GHz all-mode transceiver brings ICOM's direct sampling to the VHF, UHF weak signal world. This radio really has me excited by the possibilities of being able to operate moon bounce or meteor scatter, or with some additional components, the ES-HALE 2 geosynchronous satellite. The IC9700 has the same form factor as the IC7300 and will certainly complement your existing HF radios. The IC9700 all-mode transceiver is loaded with innovative features such as dedicated amateur satellite operation, color touchscreen, built-in D-Star capability, RF direct sampling on the VHF and UHF bands, dual independent receivers capable of full duplex operation, as well as dual watch, ICOM's feature to allow you to listen in two places at the same time. Output power on the IC9700 is 100 watts on 2 meters, 75 on 70 centimeters, and 10 watts on 1.2 gigahertz. The ICOM IC9700 is available now from your local ICOM dealer. If you're going to the Dayton Hamvention this May, be sure to stop at the ICOM booth in Building 2 to see the new IC9700 and ICOM's complete line of amateur radio transceivers for every band and every ham radio operator. You can become one of the lucky winners to take home some limited edition swag kits by visiting ICOM's website to enter the drawing by clicking on the IC9700 image in this week's show notes page. I'm grateful to have ICOM as a sponsor of the QSO Today podcast and appreciate their support. And when you buy your ICOM 9700 or any other fine ICOM product, be sure to tell your ICOM dealer that you heard about it here on QSO Today. And now back to our QSO. Did Dentron have any unique technology that contributed to the hobby and the state-of-the-art that you were involved in?
I wouldn't say anything that was really totally unique. Among the things we built, one thing we did was work with the Civil Air Patrol. Before I started at Dentron, I made friends with several people in the local Civil Air Patrol. Back then, Heathkit had a sideband transceiver for Civil Air Patrol use. So the deal I made with the local people, for the most part, they had receivers which were provided a government surplus, and they got a AM transmitter. Most of them were Johnson Rangers or Vikings, Viking Valiant. What I would do is build the Heathkit unit and the power supply, buy it, build it, and trade it for the receiver and transmitter they had on AM. So most of the receivers I got were Collins R390s or R391s, which of course were very easy to sell back then because they were great general coverage with receivers. And I got a smattering of AM transmitters, which I also sold. So I did pretty well with that. And then when I started with Dentron, we had a huge amount of parts for a radio they were trying to make that was 80 through 10 meters, just the 5 normal low bands, 80, 40, 20, 15, and 10. And the last thing they did, they originally made it analog with a dial on it. And the last thing Dennis had, who was a guy who founded Dentron, he started it in his basement originally. Last thing he did, they had a transceiver covered the 5 bands from 80 to 10, had a digital readout, and it was built out of it used from a company called Mizuho. They made a board called the SG9, which was a sideband, kind of the heart of a sideband transceiver. It was a 9 megahertz band that ran sideband, and if you built, a VFO and something to get it to the band you want and convert the band down, you could build, we actually built the MLX Mini, the single band radios. Dentron built they built an HF200, which was analog. It was not, in my opinion, really a real good radio. A lot of the leads in the thing were too long. It worked after a fashion, but not real well. And the digital one didn't work too well either.
Now, it's my understanding that when Dentron's doors closed, I read that you purchased a prototype transceiver that included the workbands. Did that transceiver have a name, and do you still have it?
Yeah, it's actually the name on the front of it. It says MLX 2500, and it runs about 100 watts on 80 through 10, including the work bands. Yeah, it's quite a nice radio. It has speech compression, passband tuning, and a lot of nice features that were fairly new at the time.
Is it safe to say that you have the only Dentron MLX 2500 transceiver in the world?
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Yeah, it's one of a kind. We had a fellow who took over the company. His name was, of all things, Morris Messenger. He claimed to have the call letters W6PUT, but I never found any trace of him having that call or any actual valid amateur license. But he got an investor which took over the company from Dennis Had. Originally, Dennis had the very first Dentron product. They made a converter that worked with a 80-meter sideband transceiver that put it on 160 meters, because virtually all of the sideband transceivers at that time were 80 through 10. The only one that offered any 160-meter coverage were the Drake separate transmitters and receivers, not their transceivers. And so then he made a thing to get on 160, and they built that. He started in his basement, and I have one of those radios.
As well?
Yeah, I bought one off eBay, and I recognized a fair number of the parts in it. There used to be a surplus store in Cleveland called Electronic Surplus. A lot of he got a reasonable number of the parts from there.
It's my understanding that once Dentron's doors closed, you actually changed careers and you entered the field of MRI, or magnetic resonance imaging, which I believe was just kind of getting going at that time in the early 80s. How did that happen? And was that also in the Cleveland area?
Yes. A company called Picker X-Ray, who used to be a fairly good-sized company in Cleveland. They were ultimately bought by Philips, and in fact, Philips currently uses the building they had in Cleveland. But after Dentron Radio closed down, I worked with them a little bit.
You're kind of one of the early pioneers in MRI and magnetic resonance imaging.
Yeah.
Right, and you started at Picker X-Ray, which later was acquired by Philips. What was new and interesting about magnetic resonance imaging, and how did that happen for you? How was it that you found Picker X-Ray, or they found you?
Well, they actually ran an ad in the Cleveland paper looking for someone who had RF experience and analog electronic experience.
So your choice in your degree to specialize in the analog side, plus spend all of those years working on radio products, was really a plus then.
Oh, yeah. So I put together a resume, sent it to Picker X-Ray, and they contacted me for an interview. I went down there to interview. Apparently that went pretty well, because they actually called my home while I was driving back home. When I got there, my wife at the time said, well, Picker X-ray called. They're offering you a job. So I started with them, and I was immediately put into the advanced development group, which got to work on all the kind of new stuff. And they had hired a gentleman from England who had worked with, built a MRI scanner in England, and his job was to come up with one that we could build here. And we did. We built initially a 0.3 Tesla, a half Tesla machine, and then ultimately a 1.5 Tesla.
And what does that mean? What is the, for those of us that, and I don't think it was on my ham radio test, what is the Tesla unit?
It's a unit of magnetic strength. The Earth's magnetic field is about half a Tesla, and the machine we made, the first one, they were kilotesla, so they were more than 1,000 times the Earth's magnetic field. They were, the original magnets were just electromagnets, and the later ones were cryogenic. They were cooled by liquid helium down to about 2 or 3 degrees above absolute zero. And they used the wire, it was called, the material, the alloy was called niobium, and it has zero resistance superconduction.
Is there a way to explain how a MRI works in 50 words or less?
Well, sort of, yeah, sure.
Can you give it a chance? I've never been in one, but my wife has, and I have no idea how they work.
Okay, there's a fairly good-sized magnet which has a hole through the middle of it, and of course the windings are around that. And that magnet produces a field. The ones we ultimately built in quantity were somewhere between half a kilotesla and 15 kilotesla. And
now, does the patient pass through that center?
Yeah, the patient is actually inside of it. He's inside the magnet. And then there are coils inside that tube that will make slight field alterations, either in and out, up and down, or left to right. Basically what you'll do, for example, if you want to take a slice through the body that is, like slices the body in half, head to feet, when they're transmitting initially, they put on a field that alters the field a little bit from head to feet direction, and then they will transmit at a given frequency, and it will excite a narrow slice, usually a couple centimeters up to a millimeter thick, usually 3 to 5 centimeters, and you'll excite that slice, and that gets the protons in the water atoms to be spinning, and then they'll put on a thing, say, that goes left to right for a moment, and that'll alter the phase of the various spin systems left to right by their position. Then when they read the signal out, they'll put on one that goes top to bottom, and they'll receive it either with a body coil or a local coil that picks up the signals, amplifies the radio signals, and acquires all the views. And then with that set of that, they'll take either usually 128 or 256 different phase encoding views, and they have a computer that will put together a image that corresponds to the data they've collected.
To simplify this for me, the system is transmitting on specific frequencies. The magnet is used to narrow the field of the body that it's transmitting into, and then it's the signal that's being transmitted is then received with a separate coils or separate antenna on that same frequency, and it's like a sonar. It's the way things are bouncing through the body, and it's received that makes the image.
Yeah, that's basically correct. The whole magnet will take the body, say, to 15 kilotesla, which is 64 megahertz, basically, right around there. And then by making the local changes, they'll get slices that are exact frequencies, and they can excite them individually and then receive them back when the spin systems will become excited, and they'll give off a signal, and they'll receive them back, and by the phase information and the frequency information,
that's very clever.
A computer will figure out where the signals are. So fortunately in that, there's a fair amount of digital processing, which is done by the computer. And when I had drawings, I was explaining this to like the local quarter-century wireless group. I said, I had the signal being acquired by a preamp, a coil and a preamp and a receiver. Then I had a box marked "A Miracle Occurs," and then out of it appears the image. I'm not good with the signal processing to make the image, but all the analog processing.
Let me take a quick break here to tell you about my favorite amateur radio audio podcast, the Ham Radio Workbench Podcast with George, KG6VU, and Jeremy, KF7IJZ, where they pursue topics, technology, and projects on their ham radio workbenches every 2 weeks. George and Jeremy document their projects and make circuit boards available for sale to their listeners. They have interesting guests and go in deep. Even if you're a seasoned ham radio builder or just getting started, be sure to join George and Jeremy for the Ham Radio Workbench podcast. Use the link on this week's show notes page by clicking on the image. And now back to our QSO today. So is it safe to say that the analog side of the MRI hasn't evolved as much over the years as the digital signal processing, based on Moore's law, have kind of exploded in terms of their size and speed and capability? Yeah, although the analog, we kept a pretty good pace. We excite the slices and then have to acquire the data. So we did all the signal processing to get the protons in the water in the body spinning, and then we received the signal back from it, and that's all analog. So I worked on that aspect of it. But the basic science of the analog side, has that changed a lot over the years? Well, it's gotten more sophisticated and it works better. And of course, they went to stronger and stronger field strengths. Was there any way to eliminate the niobium alloy and not have to supercool the unit, or is that still being done? It's still being done. Uh-huh. But they've gotten very good at it. Actually, General Electric there was a company in England called Oxford Magnets that made these things, and GE has, I guess, a couple facilities in this country that make the supercooled magnets. They're now good enough. They fill them up with, they used to use liquid helium and liquid nitrogen as another buffer to the room temperature. They now don't need the liquid nitrogen. They just use the liquid helium. They have the thermal insulation is good enough that that's all they need. They get the thing cold. They have a thing that captures any of the helium that boils off and stores it. And of course, they'll recompress it, reliquefy it, and use it again, because the United States pretty much the only country that has helium wells. And we do have some. I think they're mostly down south. In fact, when they first drilled them,
the first helium well, they drilled into it. They found they had a vein that had a fair amount of pressure, and they thought the stuff coming out was natural gas. So they went to light it, and, in a big display, and of course it immediately blew out the match, because helium does not burn.
Well, that's interesting.
They soon discovered it was helium, but helium's a very useful material. Everything from, party balloons to MRIs and other things that may use supercooling.
Now, you were involved with MRI technology and research all the way till your retirement?
Yes, that's correct. Yeah, I worked for Picker X-ray for a little over 5 years, and then a fellow who was actually the recruiter for Picker called me and said he's got another opportunity in Pittsburgh, and I went to work for a company named Medrad, which originally made devices to inject contrast agent for CT scanning and stuff. And they got into the building of MRI coils and other devices to work inside the MRI machine, like patient monitors and stuff like that. So I worked for them for a little over 20 years.
On how many MRI patents is your name?
In the United States, I have 38 patents total. 36 of them deal with MRI sort of specifically, and 2 of them are a little bit more general. They deal with things like pin diodes, which are used for RF power switching and stuff like that. So I have 38 patents in the U.S., and it's way over 100 internationally.
You write for Electric Radio Magazine, which is a very fine magazine published in Colorado, about vintage ham radio equipment. Are you a collector and restorer of vintage ham radio gear?
Yeah, I have a huge collection of stuff, and everything I've collected is made either in the United States, and I have a few pieces made in England. I don't own anything from Japan. I strictly stay with the U.S.-made stuff, which, of course, in the 60s and early 70s was all we had. Well, I would say 30s through early 70s, everything was made here, and then, of course, the Japanese have now pretty much taken it over. Not totally, but a lot of it.
With all of that vintage gear, do you have one that's your absolute favorite?
Well, I have several that I think were very sophisticated. Probably one of my favorites is the Galaxy 5, which was originally produced by Leo Meyerson, who owned World Radio Laboratories, which was a huge distributor in Iowa. And he started WRL and then Globe Electronics. And after that, he started Galaxy, and they made the Galaxy 5, which is really a nice 5-band transceiver. It's all the original ones are all vacuum tubes. The last ones they made have a considerable amount of transistors in them, but that grew over the years. But that's one of my favorites. And the Signal 1 you mentioned, it's all solid state except for the final amplifier, which is an 8072 tube, which years ago was made by RCA, when RCA was a huge manufacturer of TVs, parts, transmitting and receiving tubes, all kinds of stuff. Yeah, of course, now they're gone, but
they were a big supplier. Now, you're right. We did talk about the Signal 1. We talked before we started the conversation, started recording.
Yeah.
What can you tell me about Signal 1? I remember the company when I was just a young ham. It kind of was like a flash in the pan, right? It was there for a short time and then gone?
Well, they started out, I think, 1968, 69. I know I used to work for, they said Pioneer Standard at the time, but the first one we actually received and delivered to a customer was actually in 1970. It took them quite a while to get this thing out, but it was all solid state except for the one vacuum tube had the power supply, speaker, and pretty much every accessory you might want to have except a antenna tuner was built in. It had two VFOs, so you could split the transmit and receive frequencies. It had a code keyer built in. It had a speech processor. It had passband tuning for receiver work. It was really a very sophisticated product. And
as I recall, there were only like 857 or something like that made. There's a list of owners on the internet.
Yeah, I actually am fortunate enough to have two of them. The first one, actually, my wife and I went to a local ham fest in Pittsburgh, and I described the Collins KWM 380 to her, the colors and stuff, and sent her off in hopes she might find one of those. We used to carry a couple walkie-talkies, and she called me and said, I found a radio that's the colors you described, but it doesn't say Collins KWM 380. I got more details, and I found out it was a Signal 1. So I went and looked at it, and I wound up buying it. We took the thing home, and actually I have a little vertical in the backyard. I have a Neutronics 4BTV with a 80-meter resonator on it, 75-meter resonator, really. So I hooked it up to the Signal 1, put it on 20 meters, and I heard a station coming in really very strong, and his call was 9 Alpha 9 Alpha Alpha, and he was in Belgrade, Yugoslavia. So I, stayed on him, and after he called his CQ, I actually had my wife call him. She wasn't licensed at the time, but of course I was right there, so she could speak on the radio. And the female voice out of all the people that called him caught his attention right away, so he called her back immediately, and we worked him. That was the first contact made with the Signal 1, which was kind of a fun contact to make.
Why do you think that these old radios are selling now for more than their original cost?
Well, they usually have something special. And the Signal 1s, they don't usually, maybe some of the later ones, which were quite a bit more rare, might. But things I have, like I have a Davco DR30. It's a little receiver. It's all solid state. I actually wrote it up both for electric radio, and I have an article into QST, which they will be publishing. They've accepted it, but they haven't printed it yet, I don't believe. Anyhow, it was all solid state. It fits, it's in a box about the size of I think it's 4 by 5 by 6 inches and weighs 7 pounds. It runs on 12 volts, of course, and it actually works remarkably well. It uses a Collins mechanical filter on sideband and a single crystal added to it for CW, and it goes around the mechanical filter for AM. That radio will sell for, probably 3 to 8 times what it sold for new. But they're quite rare. They only made a little less than 1,000 of them. So the number of people who would like to have one far exceeds the number that are available.
And now this message from QRP Labs. QRP Labs has shipped thousands of QCX QRP transceivers kits to date. The odds of working another QCX user gets better every day. If you're looking for a satisfying kit experience where you end up with an amazing performing QRP transceiver for under $50, let me say that again, for under $50, then you owe it to yourself to go to QRP Labs. We have many home brewers who listen to the QSO Today podcast. For you, QRP Labs also has parts, filters, enclosures, and other handy devices to make your home brewing experience even better. You can use these parts to either enhance your QRP Labs kits or to beef up your own homebrew designs. Be sure to browse Hand's entire website. Use the link on this week's show notes page or the one in the sponsored section of the QSO Today website to get to QRP Labs to buy your QCX or any of the other fine QRP Labs kits or parts. QRP Labs is my go-to ham radio kit company. It should be yours too. QRP Labs. And now back to our QSO Today. So George, what do you think? What do you think of a new Collins 75A2 sold for? That radio was made, at the end of the World War II?
Well, 75A and 75A1 was the first. The A2 was probably somewhere around 49.50.
Okay, so that radio is now 70 years old.
Yeah, I actually have one that I use on AM. It still works fine. It's probably got, I would guess, maybe a third of the original tubes in it yet, and still going strong.
And what do you think that receiver sold for when it was new?
Oh, probably around $500. Collins was not cheap.
Okay, so I'm looking on eBay right now, and here's it doesn't say it's restored, but it looks kind of okay, set Collins 75A2, and it's about $700, 70 years later.
Yeah, well, I would imagine it still works, and actually works quite well.
I guess it's just kind of amazing that this stuff is holding its value so well.
Well, they're nice receivers, and as I say, they work relentlessly. I have 3 Collins stations, and the older one is from the 50s. The transmitters may be 53, and the receiver's 49.50. And I have a S-line, which is from the 60s. I have a separate transmitter, receiver, the station console, linear amplifier, and I have the 62S1, which puts the thing on 6 and 2 meters. So it actually operates 80 through 2, rather.
It's just kind of amazing. It's amazing that the stuff still works great and it still holds its value.
Yeah.
You touched on the fact that your wife, Barbara, is also a ham. Her call sign is KB3MPF. Is she still active on the air?
Well, not too much. She basically got the license so we could communicate at Hamfest, and so she could operate if she wanted to. Actually, her sister is married to a good friend of mine. I introduced them.
Also a ham?
She also is a ham, yeah.
Oh, how about
that? They both are. He's licensed, and he's a very big CW guy. I know he enjoys contests, and he was really heavily into 160 meters for a while. So, but it's been a real good hobby, and it directed me to a career which put me in pretty good stead. I did pretty well there, 38 U.S. patents. I did okay for quite a few years.
It's led to a very meaningful personal and professional life, right?
Yeah, and now, I enjoy writing about, all the articles I've written there about American-made stuff. I don't really own much. I don't really own anything Japanese. I mean, I'll I'll occasionally buy things if I get something at a tremendous deal, or it has all the optional filters, or something I think I can resell to fuel the other stuff I like to collect.
What do you think the greatest challenge is facing amateur radio now?
Well, I suppose one of the things is to keep young people involved, because I would imagine the ham radio, a lot of the people who are heavily into it, like I am, are probably about my age. I'm 70 at the moment, just turned 70 2 months ago. So I do like to see younger people come in, and especially if they get interested in the older equipment and stuff, that's good too. I like to keep people involved, although I'm pretty sure that there are actually more hams in the United States and worldwide now than at any time in history.
Well, I think that's true. I think that what we've discovered is that they're just coming in later. I've floated this boat a few times on this show, that when we first got involved in ham radio, when you first got involved in ham radio, the average life expectancy of American males was, 67 years of age, maybe?
Yeah.
It's way over 70 now, so maybe our ham radio young people are actually in their 30s.
Oh, I imagine a lot of them are, but some are younger. But, you go to a ham fest, you'll see some fairly young people, but, there's...
It's mostly us gray-haired guys, I think.
Yeah, I would say mid-30s on up.
Do you think we should bring back the novice license?
It wasn't a bad idea. It certainly went over very well when they first introduced it.
I guess what I'm thinking is a friend of mine just got, his daughter just got her license, her technician license on vacation while they're in America, and he wants to get her a little DMR portable. And I'm thinking, a DMR portable looks a lot like her cell phone. It's too bad that, she's not starting where she's got to kind of construct her own station and build her own antennas and have the help from an older mentor that would actually kind of bring her through the hobby, through HF rather than onto DMR. What do you think about that?
Yeah, that would be a good way to get into it. But, companies like Heathkit are no longer around. Well, actually, they are, but I don't think they do much for ham radio at the moment.
Well, there's a lot of kit companies out there now, that are making, say, QRP kits, and
yeah,
they're not making the 100-watt 8-band transceiver necessarily, but they're making you can build 8-band, 6-band transceiver kits for under a couple $100 now.
Yeah, and building it and learning about it and getting it to work and using it is probably a pretty good way to start.
Good way to learn ham radio.
Yeah.
What excites you the most about what's happening in amateur radio now?
I think things like reflecting 2-meter or 432 signals off the moon and back. That's used to be a
rich man's hobby.
It was a very difficult thing to do at one time. Now it's a good deal more common, and it's been done a fair amount of times.
Right, with the digital modes.
I guess.
Yeah. You can't even hear the signals that are coming through with your ear.
Yeah. Personally, not a digital expert, but I've always been on the analog side of stuff. But that's been real good for me personally. So
do you think that moon bounce looks a lot like MRI?
What's that?
I said I'm sitting here thinking, do you think that moon bounce where you're sending a high power signal, to the moon and back, and you can't you can't hear it with your ear necessarily. Do you think it's a lot like MRI? You're sending an analog signal and digital signal processing it when it comes back?
Yeah, that's maybe in that way it's similar. A lot of...
It's my understanding you still need about 500 watts, to make a successful moon bounce contact.
Yeah.
So you still need the power.
Yeah. High power hasn't really gotten a lot less expensive. I always miss the RCA company. When I worked at Dentron, one of my favorite tubes was the 8122, and Signal 1 uses the conduction-cooled version of it, 8072. But the air-cooled one, they dissipate 400 watts apiece, and at one time they were, $100 and some odd a piece. They were not too expensive, and they worked just fine at 2 meters.
What advice would you give to new or returning hams to the hobby?
Well, find something you're interested in. Either the equipment. I'm pretty much focused on the equipment side of it, and I basically hobby only with the domestic stuff. But there's a lot of interesting stuff. There's a lot of QRP. I know my brother-in-law, he's a real big QRP person, too. He enjoys that.
George, I want to thank you for joining me on the QSO Today podcast. I realize, and the listeners should know, that I'm calling you at a rehabilitation hospital where you're having some physical therapy. And though it's really great that you were able to take time out from that project that you're engaged in to speak with me on the QSO Today podcast. With that, I want to thank you so much and wish you 73.
Oh, certainly 73 to you, too. You enjoyed doing it. I enjoy talking about the various stuff I've done.
Thank you so much.
You're more than welcome. I enjoyed it.
Well, I did too. 73.
Okay, 73 to you.
That concludes this episode of QSO Today. I hope that you enjoyed this QSO with George. Please be sure to check out the show notes that include links and information about the topics that we discussed. Go to www.qsotoday.com and put in KE8RN in the search box at the top of the page. My thanks to both ICOM America and QRP Labs for their support of the QSO Today podcast. Please show your support of these fine sponsors by clicking on their links in the show notes pages, or when you make your purchases, that you say that you heard it here on QSO Today. You may notice that some of the episodes are transcribed into written text. If you'd like to sponsor this or any of the other episodes into written text, please contact me. Support the QSO Today podcast by first joining the QSO Today email list by pressing the subscribe buttons on the show notes pages. I will not spam you or share your email address with anyone. Become a listener sponsor monthly or annually by clicking on the sponsor buttons on the show notes page. I am grateful for any way that you show appreciation and support. It makes a big difference. QSO Today is now available on iHeartRadio, Spotify, Libsyn, and TuneIn, as well as the iTunes Store. If you own an Amazon Echo, you can say, "Alicia, play the QSO Today podcast from TuneIn." I still use Stitcher to listen to podcasts on my smartphone. The links to all of these services are on the show notes pages on the right side. Until next time, this is Eric 4Z1UG 73. The QSO Today podcast is a product of KEG Media Inc., who is solely responsible for its content.